Welcome to Mission Minded, the podcast where we explore outside-the-box thinking in carrying out Christ's Great Commission. On this episode, we kick off Season 3 with David Thomas. David is a new addition to the ITEC team who is focused on furthering the mechanical training. The majority of his working career has been spent fixing or repairing cars, and now has the ability to use those talents to invest in Christ followers around the world. His journey to working for a ministry full-time didn't happen overnight, but by listening to God one step of faith at a time. We hope that you enjoy this episode and are challenged in your own life by hearing how God has been leading others. Now here's your host, Jim Tingler, and new co-host and member of the ITEC team, Kristin Engel.
Hi, and welcome back to Season 3 of the Mission Minded Podcast. I'm Jim, joined by Kristin.
Good to be here, Jim.
So we heard a lot of feedback. People were interested in having more of a female presence. So Kristin's here.
Here I am.
I hope you can live up to the desire of the audience to kind of bring a balance here.
I hope the same thing too. So y'all need to let us know.
We're kicking it off with somebody that's near and dear to your heart.
Yes.
The first episode is David.
That's right. My father.
Yeah.
Right.
So cool story. We just wrapped it up. And just growing up, did you ever see your dad in a place where he'd be working with a mission organization full time like this?
I don't think growing up that was maybe anything in my mind, but as life has progressed and seeing where God has taken him and my mom, it makes complete sense.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's a fun story, awesome journey.
It is.
And one thing that stood out, just, I think probably for the audience will be, he does have a little bit of a Southern drawl.
Mm-hmm, a little bit.
And where did your Southern drawl go? Because you grew up in the same area.
Yeah, I did grow up in the same area. But then I moved away, and we've lived outside of the South for quite some time, and you kind of find yourself sticking out a whole lot more when you leave the South. So just over time, I kind of feel like it's become a little more neutralized. It's not totally gone, but it's a little more neutral.
You can pull out if you need to.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we love it. We give him a hard time about it, but it's part of his character, and
Sure
we love
is.
having him. And so it's an awesome story. And again, I think one of the keys that he mentioned was just to be available. Mm-hmm. Look at what's in your hand, the tools that God's given you, and just
Yes.
be available to serve. And so awesome story. And I think everybody's going to enjoy it.
I think so too. I know I enjoy it. I might be a little biased, but I think everyone else will too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we hope you enjoy this episode of the Mission Minded Podcast. This has been a long time coming.
Yes, it has. In fact, I can't hardly believe that we're doing this.
We've had a couple of times we've tried to set this up. It got postponed, but we're here. It's actually happened. The podcast with David.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's a lot of legends and myths surrounding this, but in order to fact check those, we have your daughter, Kristin.
I'm going to keep you straight here, Daddy.
Okay, well, you will.
So for those that might not know, they might have recognized an accent. So where does that accent come from?
Yeah, so from South Carolina,
Okay.
a small town in Clover, South Carolina. That's where it comes from. Yep.
Okay, well, we've grown to love it around here. We give you a little bit of a hard time about it. But
That's all right.
yeah, it's all part of the package. So I've done a little bit of traveling with you internationally, and I'm just curious, has this been a challenge in some of the communications, just, the Southern drawl? How well does that translate into other contexts?
Well, it's funny that you say that. So sort of the joke is our translators have to have translators. So the ITEC trainer that I might be with has to translate to the translator before he can translate to the students what I'm actually saying.
Right.
And then sometimes that doesn't work. Depends on where the ITEC trainer's from.
What kind of words might you just give a little bit of complexity?
Well, so I don't know if they're words, but maybe terms. So, when I got here to Florida, no one knew what a car was that was a straight drive. That's been a big thing, that no one knows what a straight drive is, and I'm surprised by that.
What's a straight drive?
Well, so it can also be called a manual transmission, or a stick shift. But back where I'm from, we just called them straight drives. And no one around here seems to. There's been a very few people come through here that's known what that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oil was another one I've heard.
Yeah, I never realized I didn't pronounce the I.
Okay.
It was just
Just oil.
It's just oil.
Yeah.
You
just
change your oil.
All right.
And so I get. There's probably a whole lot more, but
Yeah.
a lot of folks.
We'll get to that.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
So we'll let Kristin, I know you know where to go and
Yeah.
to get the good story.
Yeah. So I know a lot about you, but for those who don't know, tell us a little bit about where you're from. I know you lived there your entire life before you came here to Florida. So tell us a little bit about where you're from and your vocational background. What did you do before joining us at ITEC?
Sure. So I was born and raised in a small town in North Carolina, in Gaston County, North Carolina, and lived there my entire childhood through grade school, through community college. And in 1985, I married my now wife and of 36 years. And we moved to a neighboring county just across the state line, about 25 minutes away, a little town in South Carolina called Clover. And so my entire life, my earliest memories of working on vehicles, working on trucks or cars or whatever, was at a very early age with my dad and a bumper jack in a gravel driveway, with the back of a pickup in the air. I'm not sure I was helping, but anyway, it had something to do with the rear brakes. And I remember that very early on. And since that time, all through the time we lived in Clover, that's all I've ever done is mechanical work. Small engines, large engines, off-road equipment, trucks, tractors, whatever, cars. And so that's what I done that's all I ever know. For 40 years, I did it professionally.
And that's what you're doing at ITEC now, is working on mechanics.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
There's a little bit of a disconnect, or not disconnect, but a little bit of a journey to get to that point. So a disconnect for the audience to know, who is this guy, David? He's working with ITEC on the mechanical team, and how did he get to this point? But maybe before we get to that, maybe you could share a little bit about some of your mission experiences.
Yeah.
That before you ran into ITEC.
Okay.
So what did that look like for you?
Sure. So when my wife and I got married and we moved to Clover, we joined a church there who we had been members of the entire time we've been there. And, missions was a thing that was always on the forefront of our minds. It was always promoted as being either, senders or goers or whatever, supporting missions. And so, our kids were small. So at that time, international missions just wasn't something that was really on our radar for a variety of reasons. So as a family, we would always make it a point with our church or other ways, do some type of mission projects or mission trips, we call them. And so we began doing that. The very first trip I ever went on was a trip to Wisconsin. And it was to do what most of those trips always ended up being, was construction things, 2x4, sheetrock, just construction things, which were important. It just wasn't what I was good at doing. I could do it, but I wasn't good at it. So, and that was a huge deal, just the leap of faith, just to get in a van and ride, 24 hours with a bunch of guys up. And that was a big deal. And So as we continued to do those kind of things, we would go on trips, with the kids and to different places in America, and so I remember probably one of the things that kind of, we're talking about lead me here, was we were preparing to go on a trip to South Dakota. And we were going to pull a camper, and besides my wife and I, Kristin and Stephen and Donna and myself, we were going to take two friends of ours, Roger and his daughter Rachel. So there were 6 of us in the Suburban. We had a camper loaded up, and so we were, a day or two before we left. And so I had a good friend of mine that we always prayed together once a week. Every morning we would drive to the church and we would meet there and pray together. And this particular morning, I don't know how we got into conversation, but it was about Moses. And we just got in a conversation about Moses and about how God used Moses for, in a mighty way, by allowing him to use the exact tool that he had in the staff that he had in his hand. His vocation, or he was a shepherd, so he used a staff. And how God allowed him to use that same tool for all these mighty miracles that God performed, using the exact same thing that was in his hand. And that I don't know, we just talked about that morning. And that's never left me. So the night before we were leaving for South Dakota, it was a construction thing, and kids were going to do some backyard Bible schools. I couldn't get that off my mind. And so I go out and I have like 2 5-gallon buckets of construction tools, because that's just not what I do. And I put, 500-600 pounds of jacks and jack stands and sockets and wrenches and toolboxes and all this stuff in the camper. And I come back in the house, and it's two 12-hour days driving. And my wife says, well, there's something wrong with the camper. I said, no, why? I saw you out there with jacks and stuff. I said, well, I'm not taking construction tools. I'm taking tools that I use. She said, well, that's not what this is. What are you going to do? I said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but this is what I'm taking. So we made the journey up, and we got there, and there's this, we're in this big room, and so the I don't remember the guy's name, was over the entire event. So he was dividing everybody up into teams. So if you're going to go work at this construction site here, Backyard Bible Club's over here. And I was the last man standing, and I hadn't moved. And so I walked up to him, introduced myself, and he said, yeah, so what are you doing here this week? And I went, oh, I don't know yet. And he kind of looked at me perplexed. And I said, do you have anything mechanical or transportation related that's broken that needs to be repaired? And he said, man, yes, we do. We have a bus out here that's been broken for 2 years. We can't find anybody to fix it. And I said, well, I'm your guy. So some other work we did that week, some of the motor homes had some issues driving up there, so we got those repaired. But we were able, a friend of mine, Charlie, and I were able to get this bus fixed and get brakes on it. And I never really thought anything about it. We got it finished, and we kind of took a victory lap around all the construction sites. It was the very last day because, parts and those kind of things. So when we got it done, so the plan was to go the first week and do this work at this reservation, and then the second week we were going to drive further west and have a family vacation out at the Badlands, Mount Rushmore. Well, that night, the night before the morning we were supposed to leave, this whole series of tornadoes came through, And you remember that, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. It's fun being in a camper in a tornado.
So, and there were hailstones as large as you guys' coffee cups, and I've never seen anything like it. In fact, it totaled our camper, our vehicle, everything was total lost that night. Yeah, and so, and not only our stuff, everybody's stuff. All the lenses in the cars, windows knocked out. We didn't have a window in our camper. I mean, and so we got everything patched up the best we could, and we drove home. And it was a long way home because our kids didn't get to do the fun part. About a week later, I got a phone call. And it was the guy that was over the whole mission thing. And he called to say, David, I just want to let you know something. I said, what's that? He said, and these were his words. He said, well, I didn't tell you this part. So at that time, there was this big powwow going on, right? And it was just thousands and thousands of people. And he said that because the fact they had that bus, they rescued hundreds of people out of a valley that flooded that night. They were all in tents, and they had no way out. He said, we rescued hundreds of people out of that valley that night because we had that bus and they were able to drive it. And I thought, man, that's pretty cool that God could use me in a way for something that I do, like Moses. I mean, in a way, the tools I use for His glory and for and that was a really eye-opening thing for me. And so, so that's kind of was a couple of events, the whole story of Moses, and then that event sort of changed the way I started seeing myself and being used in missions, I guess you might say. Yeah.
And I know a lot of people back home know about your gift and fixing things. And there was a guy at the church that you went to who knew that about you, and he approached you. And it's kind of what brought you here to ITEC. So tell us a little bit about your experience with ITEC and what led you here. The big decision to move to Florida, to leave the place that you lived your whole life, where I was born and raised. Tell us about that decision.
Yeah, so I had a shop at my house, and I did a lot of work for a lot of people. And what started out to be for support my family ended up kind of being to help people. I mean, primarily. And so a guy that had traveled with ITEC, a dentist in our town, he brought I was doing some work for his son. And Ernie, he didn't even know that I did this kind of thing at home. So he began to bring things to my house, and very regularly.
Things that needed repair?
Yeah, like chainsaws or primarily chainsaws, I think is what he brought. I think I had a pressure washer or something a time or two. But anyway, it was small engine stuff. And we would start bringing stuff to my house just randomly. And I thought, well, that's kind of odd. So he had, and I know Ernie was really heavy into missions and going and doing foreign training or traveling. And so he asked me if I'd ever had watched the movie The End of the Spear. And I said, no, I haven't. So he said, I brought you a copy. I want you to watch it. I said, okay. So my wife and I, we watched it. And he asked me about it later, what I thought about it. And I said, well, it was a very interesting movie. I wasn't exactly sure what he was looking for. And so he said, well, Dave, we're going, and he names this country in Africa. That's really funny name. It was to me. And he said, would you like to go to this country? And I just looked at him. I'm like, they make a pill for that, don't you? It sounded like a disease. I mean, I didn't even know what he meant. I said, what do you mean? He said, no, it's in Africa. And I said, okay. Well, let me think about it. He said, we need to know soon. We're buying tickets. I'm like, whoa. So I go in the house. I tell my wife that this offers, he's offered me to do this. And I'm really looking for her to say, well, you can't because of blah, blah, and no, not at all. Oh, so you thinking you're going to do it, huh? I think you probably will. I said, no, I don't know. So that night I prayed about it that night, and this was just completely out of the blue. And I knew I had to go. I knew I had to. So that was my first experience with ITEC, was going on that trip. And, yeah.
So that was a short-term training trip you went on.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ernie was a training dentist.
Mm-hmm.
And you went to train in mechanics.
Correct.
And so what did that look like?
Well, I didn't have any idea what to expect. Mm-hmm. I had zero expectations. I had no idea. So when we got there, it was hot. Mm-hmm. And you were there.
I was there. Yeah. We were training in film.
Right.
On the film team.
Exactly.
And so for those that might have cell phones, ever left them out in the dashboard of the car and they overheat, this was happening in the shade.
Oh.
Just everything was just overheating.
In the shade.
Yeah, it was hot. So
very hot. I didn't know what to expect, so we show up and I'm just kind of following, B's lead. I'm just following his lead, who was heading up the training. And, I was about 2 days into this, maybe 3 days, and we were sitting in that building, that shed that we were training in, and it was James and Steve and I were sitting there, and I wasn't really sure what was happening. I just wasn't sure. So they were kind of talking back and forth to each other, and I was just sitting there, trying to nibble on something and drink some water, and I heard one of them say, "I'm not sure, he hasn't said anything yet." And I realized they were talking, to me. And I turned around and I said, what was it? And Steve said, well, James asked me what you thought about the training. He said, you haven't said a word about what you thought about it or anything. And I said, man, this is something I've got to be a part of. This is not something that I'm going to quickly be over. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people's had those mission trip experiences, and you think,
right.
But I had enough of those to know this is not what this is.
Right.
But I didn't know what was going on. I had zero idea what was happening to me, and so, yeah. So after that trip, sometimes my processor's slow, and I came home, and Kristin and Kyle were living in Maryland at the time. And so the day after we got back, or maybe the next day, we were going to drive to Maryland. And I haven't even spoken a word to Donna, because I didn't know what to tell her. I just didn't know what to tell her. So we're in the car, and I remember exactly where we were. We were about an hour up the road of an 8-hour drive. And I said, I think I want to talk to you about this trip some. And so she says to me, well, let me tell you what God has done for me. So she said, when I pulled up to our house one day, I'd been gone maybe 2 or 3 days. She said, this is the home we lived and raised our children in. And she said, I pulled up and I just stopped and looked at our home and whatever. And she said, God just said to her, this is just a house. You can let all this go. And so quite frankly, I didn't want to hear that. that wasn't, I didn't want to hear that. I'm like, whoa, we need to pump the brakes here a little bit. I was not going there. And so so I told her I wasn't sure what happened, and then, what all God was doing. But so we came home from Maryland, and soon after that, we made a trip down to Florida. And at that time, I just said, I would really like to be a part of, if I could, 2 trips a year. I really thought that would be a fix for me.
Mm-hmm.
Get a couple trips a year in, that'll scratch that itch, and we'll just get on with life. Oh man, it didn't happen. 2 trips a year just didn't do it. So I just continually thought about ITEC every day. I mean, every day. And so finally, one December of 20, what is this, 21, 22, 20, I'm sorry. Our pastor preached, it was Christmas, and he preached a sermon on the announcement to Mary, announcing the birth of the Savior. And just how that whole birth of her being a virgin and the whole culture of not being accepted, and how everyone wasn't going to understand, but how God used, that's the way the Savior was going to come into the world. And what might have appeared to be risk for her, because it didn't make sense. Mm-hmm. But God had called her to do it. And in spite of everything that could have happened to her, she said yes. And even Joseph, he had the same thing going on. And he said, everybody's never going to understand when God calls you. They're not going to understand. It's not going to make sense to you.
Right.
And so I knew then. So I came home, and I talking to Donna about that. And she said, well, you need to call and talk to Jamie. And I said, I'm not calling him today. I'll be over this tomorrow. Well, I wasn't over it tomorrow. And so I called him, and then I drove down. 2 days later, I was here. That was Sunday. That was Monday. That Wednesday, I was here. And I had made that decision there that we were coming here. We were just leaving everything.
Yeah, it was, 7 months later?
Yeah, it's been since June. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 7 months later, so June 2021. So
yeah,
giddy up, you're in. It's been awesome.
Yeah,
and we got a 2-for-1 as well.
Yeah, sure did.
Yeah,
it worked out great having Kristin here too. Yeah. So,
but that's how I got here.
So what'd you think of all of that while your dad was wrestling with this and just through the years and him finding this? Did you think it was going to last? Did you think it was just a fad or?
No, it seemed like when I would talk to Dad about this and even talk to Mom and get her side of things, it kind of seemed, not kind of, it was the missing puzzle piece, kind of like the sequel to what made sense for my dad's life and his skills and his ability. And it's something that my husband and I were talking about it, that only God could put together and write, like to create my dad to be the perfect fit with the right set of skills for an organization that furthers the gospel. Because my whole life, Dad would share the gospel with everybody that he had the chance to, and to see God take that passion that he had, for the Lord and bring it together with his passion to help others through being a mechanic. It made sense. It made sense from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we were not surprised at all when this decision was made.
That's awesome. So for those that might be listening that have thought, well, what role can I play, in the work of kind of this bigger mission, the Great Commission, what advice might you give them as they wrestle through that?
Yeah, I think think for me, I think everybody has to look at what God has put in their hands. I really believe that. And that doesn't, if you're a school teacher, or, you know, if that's what you've been equipped to do, then that can be used anywhere for God's glory. Mm-hmm. If you're I know if you're a dentist, if you're a plumber, it doesn't matter what you are. Mm-hmm. You can use what God has placed in your hand for His kingdom's work, and there's opportunities to do that. And I hear people say, and I heard people say at our home church, where, well, man, I don't know how I could help. Mm-hmm. I don't have a skill. I hear people say that. I don't think God needs your skill. I think God needs you just to be available to be used. If you're available to be used, you will be used. And I think that's the best advice I could give somebody. Just be available. Just be ready. Just say yes. Because so many times, you know, leaving a home and a place we've grown up for my entire life and raised our family, and my whole family's still there. You know, just say yes. If you just say yes, and just be open to opportunities that God puts before you, and that would be my advice. Just take what you know and use that. And there's ways. There's all sorts of creative ways to do that. So, yeah. But I think just being available and saying yes would be my advice. Be open and say yes.
That's good.
Well, we were going to talk about some of the mechanical training, but I think this might be a good place to wrap things up. What do you think, Kristin?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe you can come back and tell us about the mechanical training another time.
Maybe you could become a regular here on the podcast.
I like it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dave. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Mission Minded Podcast.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Mission Minded. For more information on today's topic and show notes, please visit our website, itechusa.org. Mission Minded Podcast is produced by ITEC. The goal of this podcast is to inspire conversations about Great Commission participation. The views, organizations, and individuals represented, interviewed, and discussed on the podcast do not necessarily represent an official position or formal partnerships with ITEC.